Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to do another mini PC review. This one here is the UM590 from MinisForum. Now this form factor may look familiar, and that's because I've already reviewed two other mini PCs that have this same shape and form. And externally, the only main difference between the two is that this model has returned to using a barrel plug for power. The previous models were a little bit less powerful, and so because of that they were able to use USB-C ports. But this one here is quite a bit more powerful. It uses the Ryzen 9 5900HX chip. And you can pick up a bare bones version for $460, or the one that I'm reviewing here, which has 16 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of storage. That's going to bring up the price to about $570 before shipping. Now last year, MinisForum released a similarly powerful device called the Elite Mini HX90. This one also used the 5900HX chip, but was quite a bit bigger and also a little bit more expensive. As you can see here, they're still selling it for $670. And so essentially the UM590 that we're checking out here today is smaller and cheaper, but with the same amount of power. Now, not to complicate things even further, but MinisForum also released another mini PC called the Neptune HX90G, and this one also uses that same 5900HX CPU. But the big difference here is that this one has its own discrete graphics card. It uses the RX 6600M, and as you can imagine, it does cost quite a bit more. This one is $350 more than the UM590 that we'll be reviewing today. And so in the end, what I want to do in this review here is take a look at the UM590 in the context of those other two models. This one here is quite a bit smaller and cheaper than those other two, and so I want to see whether or not this performance is really going to be worth that $570 asking price. And we've got a lot of testing to do, so without any further delay, let's get into it. Okay, so in general, MinisForum does a really good job of detailing all their specifications on their website, but I'll go over them really quickly here. We've already talked about the CPU a bunch, but I will mention that it has 8 cores and 16 threads, as well as onboard graphics. The model that I'm testing has 16 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of storage, but you can bump that up if you'd like within the sales page. As far as functionality, it has most of the things that we've come to expect from MinisForum products, so 3 different 4K 60Hz video outputs, as well as Wi-Fi 6, Bluetooth 5.2, and a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port. Now, in addition to the UM590 we're reviewing today, MinisForum is also working on one called the UM690, and this one's going to have quite a few spec bumps over the one we're reviewing today. To start, it's going to have the Ryzen 6900HX CPU, which is a newer chipset that came out earlier this year. Additionally, this model is going to come with higher spec RAM as well as a faster PCIe port, and it's also going to come with a USB 4 Thunderbolt port, which is going to make it capable of 8K video output. And so I'm pretty excited to test that one, and I think I'll be getting it in the mail here pretty soon, and so be on the lookout for a video for that. And the reason I'm bringing it up in this video here is because the price difference between the two is not that significant. In fact, it's only $80 more for a mini PC that, at least on paper, is clearly more powerful than the one we're reviewing today. But we'll talk about that more at the end of the video here. I don't want to shortchange the mini PC we're reviewing today, so let's go ahead and start with the unboxing and my impressions. Now you're going to find your typical stuff inside, like an instruction manual and this 120 watt power brick. Additionally, inside you're going to find an HDMI cable, as well as a stand if you want to orient this vertically. And we also have some replacement rubber feet in case you go inside of the device. Finally, we have a SATA connection for a 2.5-inch hard drive and then a VESA mount. So now let's take a look at the mini PC itself, and I gotta say I really like the fact that they are using the same form factor across many different mini PCs. On the front we have some ventilation, then a CMOS reset button, the power button, a headphone microphone jack, and then 2 USB-C ports. The one on the right is also capable of video out. Looking on the sides here, we have 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port, that barrel plug for power, and then we have 4 USB ports. 2 of them are 3.2 and the other are 2.0. And then finally 2 HDMI ports. But yeah, that's really about it. This is just a nice small mini PC. So before we actually start it up, let's go ahead and take a look at the internals next. And the reason why they ship it with additional rubber feet is because you have to pull them off in order to get inside. And so I think over time, if you got in and out of this mini PC a lot, those rubber feet would stop sticking. So I appreciate that they have those replacements available. Anyway, looking at the internal design here, it doesn't look like anything's changed. We have 2 8GB DDR4 RAM sticks rated at 3200 MHz. And then on the opposite side, we have our M.2 SSD. This one is 512 GB and made by Intel. This also has the same Wi-Fi chip as the other models, which is capable of Wi-Fi 6E as well as Bluetooth 5.2. Now, one of my favorite things about this design is it's very easy to expand the storage with a 2.5-inch drive. You can just align it up to the bottom of the case here and then screw it into place. From there, you would use that small SATA connector that came with the device and then plug it directly into the motherboard. And just like that, you've expanded your storage. And so yeah, this is one of my favorite mini PCs. It is nice and compact. You can see how small it is compared to an Xbox controller. And unfortunately, the last time we went shopping at Costco, they didn't have Kerrygold butter, so we had to grab some Costco branded ones instead. But still, as you can see here, it's about 2 sticks of butter in size. So definitely one of the most compact, powerful mini PCs out there today. Now what I want to do here is just dive directly into the benchmarks and kind of talk about some of the numbers here and what they mean. To start, we're going to run Cinebench because I want to take a look at those 8 cores and 16 threads and how they perform. And while the machine is running at a 100% load trying to do this rendering, let's go ahead and look at the power profile. And as you can see here, the CPU is drawing 45 watts of power. That's quite a bit for a mini PC like this. In terms of temperatures, you can see that it's maxing out at around 84-85 degrees. And among all of my testing, that was the absolute hottest that I ever saw it get. And so I would say that even with this very small form factor, at the factory setting of 45 watt TDP, I wouldn't expect any thermal throttling at all. Now in terms of Cinebench score, we're getting a little bit under 12,000 points at 11,810. And that's actually a pretty impressive score. If we look at the HX90G, which I reviewed earlier this month, and as you can see with this one, in spite of having its own dedicated graphics card, it was only a little bit higher in Cinebench score. In fact, that's only about 11% better than the one we're reviewing today, and it costs $350 more. And so what that means to me in terms of everyday computational tasks, things like web browsing or video editing or playback, I think that you're going to have very similar scores from this one and the other. In fact, this device runs 4K playback almost flawlessly at a full frame rate. And so if you're looking for a very small form factor mini PC that can do everyday tasks very, very well, this one's going to be a better bet than the other. You're going to be able to save $350 while still getting very similar performance. Now, of course, there's a very good reason why the other one costs $350 more, and that comes down to PC gaming performance. As you can see here, the device we're reviewing today with its onboard graphics is getting 1,643 as its Time Spy score with 3D Mark. And if we do the same test, but with the mini PC that has its own graphics card, you can see it blows it away. In fact, the HX90G has 5 times the benchmark score as the one we're reviewing today. So when it comes to pure PC gaming performance, that $350 might actually be worth it, considering that you're going to maybe get 5 times the performance. But of course, these are just benchmarks and they don't really tell that full story. So let's go ahead and do some game testing with PC games next. If you're new to my testing methodology, what I typically will do is I'll try to play everything at 1080p. I usually will start with the easiest to play games and then work my way up from there. And then as I work my way up the ladder of those harder to play games, I will adjust things like the graphical settings as well as the resolution. And so as you can see, when it comes to lightweight games, things like Castle Crashers, Streets of Rage 4, or even Hollow Knight, these can all play at 1080p with the default settings. In fact, when it came to 2D gameplay, this one did really well, including games like Hades or Ori and the Will of the Wisps. For these games, I was able to maintain a 60 frames per second average at a 1080p resolution. Now, when it came to that next level, which I consider to be the Xbox 360 era, you will find that most of these games also play pretty well too. I was able to get really good frame rate with BioShock Remastered after I turned off the real-time reflections. And same thing with Grand Theft Auto 5. This one had a very stable 60 frames per second at 1080p, but I did have to bump it down to the normal settings. Same thing with Halo Reach. For this one, I had to set it to performance settings, which is the equivalent of low, but it still looked really nice in 1080p. But really, that was about the upper limit of what I could play at a 1080p resolution. From then on, I had to drop it down to 720p or make other drastic changes. For example, with Skyrim Special Edition, this one could not pull off 1080p, but at 720p, I could at least get high settings and it looked great. Rise of the Tomb Raider also struggled to play at 1080p, but once I dropped it down to 720p and medium settings, yeah, this one also worked well too. Not quite full 60 frames per second, but definitely playable. And it was a similar story for Doom Eternal. I had to do 720p and low settings. In fact, that seemed to be the trend. Once I got to those harder to play games, I just automatically would set it to 720p and low. And at that point, once you get to some of these more modern games, you know, what I would maybe consider to be like PS4 era games, then yeah, you're not going to get 60 frames per second at 1080p. Instead, I would expect between 40 and 50 frames per second reliably at a 720p resolution instead. And so in the end, I think when it comes down to it, this is not going to be a powerhouse when it comes to playing PC games specifically. The CPU is nice and powerful, as we saw when it came to video rendering earlier, but when it comes to actually playing video games, yeah, not so great. But I think if you don't really mind having that dip in graphical fidelity and you just really want to have the ability to play a game on such a small PC, then yes, this might work in a pinch. And I know I'm a pretty picky guy, but when it comes to playing games in 720p in low settings, to me, I just don't really enjoy it that much. Let me give you a quick example. Here's Elden Ring running at 1080p in low settings. And we're getting a good average of between 30 and 35 frames per second. So in this example, what I would do is I would cap the frame rate to 30 frames per second and just enjoy it like that. Now if I wanted, I could dip it down to 720p instead and get an average of 50 to 55 frames per second. But the thing is, to me, these graphics are noticeably worse, to the point where I think it would disrupt my gameplay. And so if it came between 50 frames per second at 720p and 30 frames at 1080p, I think I would go with the 1080p instead. Either way, long story short, this does okay when it comes to PC games. It is not a powerhouse by any means, but of course if you want to stick with like 2D games, indie games, or things up to the Xbox 360 era, they're going to be great. And it is possible to push this machine to play some of those more modern games, but you will have to make some graphical sacrifices. Okay, so I think that's enough for PC games. Let's now move on to emulation, my bread and butter. And we're just going to go ahead and start with the harder to play systems. We'll start with Dolphin, which is a GameCube emulator, and we're going to run it at 1080p or a 3x resolution. And so you might be thinking, this one didn't do so great with PC games, and so it might not do great with emulation either. But the thing to bear in mind when it comes to game emulation is that a fast CPU will sometimes work just as well as something with a graphics card. And thankfully that's exactly the case when it comes to the UM590 that we're reviewing today. Because it has that nice beefy CPU, it can emulate just about everything just fine. And so specifically when it comes to GameCube, every single game I tried played at 1080p no problem. And that means even the harder to run games like F-Zero GX or Rogue Squadron 2. So absolutely, when it comes to GameCube and Wii, this is going to do just great at a 1080p resolution. Now moving on from here, we did the Citra emulator, which is made for Nintendo 3DS. And in this scenario, I did a 3x resolution, which is 720p on both screens. And as you can see, all these games are playing just fine too. There would be a dip here and there when new shaders were caching, but overall, every single game was playing at full speed, no problem. And so I would say if you're looking for a machine that can run 3DS emulation upscaled to something that will look nice on a TV or a larger display, this is going to work fine. So let's go ahead and stay on the Nintendo theme here and move on to the next system. This is the Nintendo Wii U. Now with this emulator, which is called CMU, what I did is I kept everything at the native resolution of the Wii U. But as you can see here, all the games are running at a full speed. In fact, some of these games are playing so well that you can probably upscale them to a higher resolution, something like 1080p or 1440p in some cases. Either way, I would say yes, this is very capable of playing Nintendo Wii U. Now, of course, anytime I test Nintendo Wii U, I also have to test out Breath of the Wild. And for this one, I kept it at the native resolution, but with a 40 frames per second cap. And as you can see, the gameplay is nice and smooth, a very solid 40 frames per second. Okay, let's go ahead and move up one more generation to Nintendo Switch. Now for this one, I played everything at the native resolution, but in docked mode. That means it's going to mimic the resolution of the Nintendo Switch when it's actually docked into a TV. And so the resolution is going to vary between 1080p and 720p depending on the game you play. Either way, for the most part, even when in docked mode, all these games played at a full frame rate. Generally, I've found that a lot of these mini PCs can do some of those more lightweight games no problem at a full frame rate, but once you start moving things up, it gets a lot harder. Super Mario Odyssey is usually the pinnacle example because it's very hard to get this one to run at 60 frames per second without a graphics card. But as you can see in the footage here, even with it being in docked mode, we're getting very close to 60 frames per second the entire time. In fact, among all of the Switch games that I did testing with, only Link's Awakening needed to be in handheld mode. But even then, once I turned this on, this was completely playable. It would pause here and there for shaders caching, but other than that, it was nice and smooth. So yeah, Nintendo Switch is surprisingly good on this device as well. Let's go ahead and move over to Sony now next. We'll start with the PlayStation 2. Like with the GameCube, I'm going to do this at a 3x resolution, which is a 1080p equivalent. And much like with Nintendo GameCube, almost every single game that I tried with it got 60 frames per second at a 1080p resolution. And I should mention, this is all with the default settings, so I'm not going in and changing anything or turning on any hacks. All I'm really doing is changing the internal resolution and going from there. And so this is a great spot to be in if you're going to buy a machine and you want to use it for emulation. Instead of having to fiddle around with the settings to make sure that every game works, this one is just at that level where they're just going to work anyway. Even God of War 2 was very smooth. It would hover between 59 and 60 frames per second the entire time. The only game that I had to make some adjustments to were Champions and No Wrath. I had to change this one down to 720p, but after I did that, it was 60 frames as well. So yeah, I think this is going to be a great PlayStation 2 machine. But of course, we're not done yet, so let's go ahead and move up to PS3 next. Now in this one, much like with the Wii U, I kept everything at the native resolution, which can be anywhere between 720p and 1080p depending on the game. And again, much like with the other emulated systems, I was surprised to find how good the performance was here with PS3. And in the end, a lot of that has to do with the Ryzen 9 5900HX CPU that we have in this machine. The PlayStation 3 emulator really prefers to have lots of cores and threads, and with 18 cores and 16 threads on this CPU, we're getting some really good performance. For example, Prince of Persia is really hard to run at a full frame rate in this part right here if you don't have a graphics card, and the fact that it is kind of amazing. Now of course it's not perfect. For example, with Quest for Booty here, you can see it's not getting a full 60 frames per second. It's still definitely playable, and I would say if I didn't see those frame rates up on the top, I wouldn't even notice. And so in the end, I would say yes, this is a pretty good PS3 emulating machine as well. So now let's go ahead and move over to Microsoft and finish out our trilogy with a couple Xbox systems. And to start, I found that with the original Xbox, I was surprised to find that this one performed well too. For the most part, I was able to just set everything to a 2x resolution, and then everything would play at mostly full speed. Now the main issue when it comes to Xbox emulation is compatibility and not necessarily power. And so sometimes there are going to be games that don't play at all, and it just really has to do with the accuracy of the emulation. But for the most part, when a game does run on this emulator, it does run well. There are some exceptions. For example, Halo 2 did not play at a full frame rate, especially when lots of things were happening on the screen. In fact, sometimes it would dip down even to something like 20 or 15 frames per second at points. And so I would say among all the other Xbox games, Halo 2 is the one that isn't quite playable. And to finish things out, I did play some Xbox 360 games, and no surprises here at this point, but these also played pretty well. Much like with the original Xbox emulator, it's all going to come down to compatibility. And so while the games that I'm showing here on the footage do play pretty well, there are plenty of other games that just won't boot at all. And I did a full Xbox 360 emulation video. I'll leave a link in the video description so you can get a better idea of what to expect if you do want to play Xbox 360 games on your PC. Either way, across the board, as you can see, when emulating games on Windows, this does a very, very good job. Probably some of the best I've ever seen on a mini PC that doesn't have a graphics card. But one other thing I did want to test is trying out other operating systems with this PC. And so for this example, we're going to use Batocera. This is a Linux-based operating system that is focused on retro game emulation. And so what I've done right here is I've loaded this operating system from a USB drive that's hooked up to the mini PC. The reason why I like this operating system so much is because it can transform your PC into being a retro game machine without affecting the files that are directly on the device. And so while I still have Windows installed on this machine and I can just use it like a typical PC, what I can do now is I can pop in that flash drive and start retro gaming without affecting anything else. And when it came to emulation performance, it was just as good as it was on Windows right here. And so all the things that we were doing on the Windows side of emulation, so 1080p upscale for things like GameCube and Wii and PS2, they are also possible here on Batocera. And so long story short, if you're looking for a nice and powerful mini PC that can run Batocera, this will do the trick as well. Alright, now that we've got all the testing out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about some of the things I like and what I don't like about the UM590. As always, we're going to start with what I like. Number one, I love the size and form factor of this mini PC. I realize that some people might think, well, they're just using the same shell over and over again, and to me, I actually like that. Number one, it cuts down on engineering and production costs because they can use that same shell, but I'm also a fan of the fact that if it's not broke, then why fix it? And I think when it comes to having a mini PC, having something small like this is really nice. It's also kind of cool that it comes with a vertical stand if you want to save even more desk space. Another thing I really liked about the UM590 is how good it is when it comes to emulation. Thanks to that Ryzen 9 chip that we have inside, we're able to play just about every system really well. And so while it might not do so hot when it comes to PC gaming, and more on that in a second, I do think that as an emulation machine, this is really good. I also appreciate the fact that it has multiple storage options. In addition to the M.2 slot for your primary hard drive, you have the ability to use a 2.5-inch drive as well. And finally, I think that overall, when it comes to performance with CPU-intensive tasks, this one does the job really well. And so I think if you're just looking for an everyday PC that is very small, this is one of the best you could buy today. Now, of course, this mini PC is not without flaws, so let's talk about a few of the things I don't like about it. Number one, as we saw, the PC gaming performance was a little bit disappointing, especially when you factor in the fact that this costs $570. If you're specifically looking for something that is dedicated to just PC gaming, there are easier and cheaper ways to get that done. For example, you could buy a used Office PC on eBay for pretty cheap and then cram in a GPU and probably probably get better performance than this. And so if you're specifically looking for a gaming rig that is going to be very small, I would not recommend this model right here. In fact, there are two other machines that I think might be a better deal overall. Number one would actually be the Steam Deck. I would say the performance when it comes to emulation on the Steam Deck is a little bit worse than this one, but when it comes to PC gaming, I found that the Steam Deck does a little bit better. Not only that, if you live in a region that has the Steam Deck available right now, you can get it at the starting price of $400. And so essentially you could save about $170 by getting the Steam Deck instead of this machine, and then you're going to be able to get some PC gaming performance that is a little bit better than the UM590 here, but you're also going to have a gaming handheld in the Steam Deck too. So that's kind of a win-win situation if PC gaming is your priority and you live in a region that has the Steam Deck. And finally, the other factor to consider is the UM690, which is going to be coming out here pretty soon. That one's only $80 more than the UM590, but on paper, those specs are better in almost every way. Not only will that CPU be quite a bit more powerful, but it also has faster RAM, faster storage, and a USB 4 port, which means that you can have Thunderbolt out. And with a Thunderbolt connection like that, that means you could use an external GPU for even better gaming performance, or you can have 8K video if you'd like as well. And so in the end, do I recommend the UM590 as a mini PC? I think specifically if you're looking to emulate every system under the sun, this is a pretty good deal and one of the best that I've found without a dedicated graphics card. However, the UM690, which is just around the corner, does give me pause. And like I mentioned, I should be getting the UM690 here pretty soon, and I'll be sure to do a review on that one as well. But as it stands, let me know what you think of the UM590 in the comments below. Is this one worth getting, or is it going to be worth paying that extra $80 for the 690 instead? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.